Alright, we are now live. Alright, so let's start with this one here.
We'd like to add new properties in FeedFormatter for parsing datetime string we don't know. So right now, if the formatter see a datetime string that we don't know, then we throw exceptions.
So the problem is we have two different syndication parsers. One's for Atom 1.0 and the other's for RSS 2.0.
Right.
And those specs have reasonably clearly defined date-time formats which are supposed to be used. But the internet's a bit of a wild west on these things. Lots of people don't use those formats and use significantly different ones sometimes. And the problem that customers have had is with the original syndication feed formatter on full framework, we just throw an exception when we hit something which doesn't pass how it's supposed to pass. And we can't possibly code up every single variant of every single date-time format that someone might hit. So we're doing a best effort, and then so we've added a few more formats to parse, I believe. But we're also then saying, and if that doesn't fit your bill, here's an API to where you can plug in your own parser.
That makes sense.
So what are those three strings that the parser takes?
So there's version with the delegates down there. So we have two options. Either we're going to do the funcs or we're going to do the delegates. That's the bottom version.
Oh, okay. So it's datetime string, local name. Local name is local name?
No. This is XML. So the first parameter is, this is the literal string which appears in the XML. Then the next one is, this is the name of the XML element bound, which was around that string. And then the namespace is what was the namespace for it.
And why the element around the string matters? You would parse differently based on it?
Yeah. So a customer might say, because like Atom 1.0 is extensible, and you can put any extra namespace you like in there, when we're parsing it, we want to be able to say, this is the name of namespace, so customers can either say, well, we'll just use the default one, which is in there, or they can do something.
And is it enough? Those, like, just the next immediate element, or sometimes people need the whole chain up to the root to be able to tell where they are in the document?
Yeah, like, are there attributes that people would care about, stuff like that?
There shouldn't be on this.
Okay.
So my second, so now I understand what the parameters are. Second one, why did you decide to choose delegates instead of just having a virtual method that you can override to parse?
Because this would allow someone to take their existing code and do a small change to be able to support it, whereas if you're going to make it virtual, someone has to derive the existing class, and then, so it's an amount of code, boilerplate code someone have to write just to be able to do this.
But it's so rare that people, I assume, need to do it. Do we care about the few more lines of code?
What happens if you need to override both of them in different ways? Like if you have library A giving you a way to parse URIs and library B giving you a way to parse dates, like do you now have to create a subclass type that can delegate to both of them independently?
Yeah. Or we have two different virtual methods, one for URIs, one for datetimes.
Oh, right, but I guess what I was saying is if the implementation is provided by two different people, you now have to write glue, whereas if this were a delegate, you could just hook up both methods independently.
Well, the chance of you actually having this
fair.
is so low that you have to write some glue anyway.
Yeah, what is your underlying XML reader? Is it literally XML reader, or?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? We use XML reader, and then we're passing, so there's not a serializer involved, it's actually reading the elements and there's full state tree. And
so the only difference in my opinion, the differences between delegate-based approach and the inheritance is, inheritance is cleaner in my opinion. Like this is what like, it's an abstract class, and extensibility means I override some method and implement my custom logic. But if you don't have access to the code that instantiates the formatter, then you kind of cannot use inheritance because then you need DI system to actually inject your own subtype.
Right.
Do you know if in common scenarios people actually instantiate these formatters, or they are instantiated for them?
They will instantiate it. So you're seeing, so you've got syndication feed formatter, we've got an RSS 2.0 syndication feed formatter, and an Atom 1.0 syndication feed formatter. So while this is appearing on the base abstract type, people don't ever generally, derive this type, basically ever. It's only a base type for commonality with our.
How do you instantiate one of these? You know one of the concrete ones you were just talking about?
Yeah.
Or do you get a factory method to get it out of it? Or
well, actually, it doesn't. Also, can't you use the syndication feed class, which will generate a formatter for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're not doing it directly. Okay.
So honestly, like, to me, a virtual method is kind of more naturally says it's an extensibility point. Moreover, if you add a virtual method and then in the future, let's say, you need more information to be able to parse successfully, well, you can add some protected members that people can fish out from the formatter and kind of figure out where they are and what they have. The moment you add this delegate and you need additional data to be able to parse, you need to add a new delegate and a new property. And then you have to decide which one you call, and then...
Yeah, the other question I had is you said you added a few more parsers into these, I assume, the concrete types. You're not going through this delegate to do that, are you? You have yet another mechanism for adding parser to the base type?
Oops.
So maybe I misheard you, but I thought you said one of the things you said is you added a few more formats that you can parse.
No, I'm saying this is the abstract type, and we have two concrete types,
right.
And that's what people use. Like, people don't generally derive this.
I understand that part, but like, didn't you also say you added a few couple more common parsers so people don't have to use this extensibility point at all?
And we added support for a couple more date formats. So, like, if it comes in an ISO 8601 format instead of...
Okay, so that's in the core implementation of the parser, though, is you're not going through this extension point is what I'm getting at.
Yes, we do.
You do use this extension point.
So
how do you allow them to string these different date parsers together, then?
We don't have different date parser. We have one default date parser. That parser can parse different date formats.
So they have to now parse all the different formats, not just one type? Is it going to be common to have more than one date time?
Who's going to involve
format in a given?
Who's going to involve the default one? That's your question, basically, right?
So this syndication feed formatter has two child classes, and those classes.
But there's no equivalent to call base stats.
No.
State if you want the default parsing as well.
But so as this is a property, if someone wants to do that, then they capture the existing one and
chain them, basically.
Yeah.
So to chain them, the parsers need to be able to tell whether they successfully parsed or not. Correct? How do they do this? How does this one says, I tried and I cannot parse? Blow up.
Yeah, it throws...
So this one can be only... This is the last one.
Yeah.
So that's another thing you could consider. Like, should this... Like, if we stay with delegates, should it return bool and say... Or like nullable of, results and say, like, I was able to parse or not, so you can kind of keep chaining if you have more of these routines. Written by somebody else.
If we did that, then we'd have to make a result an out, which would mean we would have to use the name delegate, because you can't do that with a func.
It's true. Which I think generally speaking, the problem with the func is, if you see a signature like this, like you have no idea. Like string. It's like which one?
We don't care which way it goes. It's just trying to have consistency with the rest of the framework, and a couple of places where I knew existed, like HTTP client handler has a server. Yeah.
It's not our best example.
Yeah. So one thing that would be nice is to actually set a rule and guideline as part of it. So this is how things are done in the future. So there's not a question of whether you use func or delegate. named delegate.
I mean, one other thing you could do, which may actually make it already simpler, is like instead of passing local name and namespace URI as literally 2 strings, you could pass in like an, I don't know, an XML qualified name or something that you get from the reader already that already has them as components. Because then it's kind of clear as the type, because you see like string, comma, XML qualified name, comma, datetime offset, right? And it's pretty clear that the string is the thing you're supposed to parse, right? Versus if you have like 3 strings, like I don't know whether it's the first, the second, or the third, or like.
Yeah.
Do we think when you're parsing one of these feeds, generally, is there more than one type of datetime parser that's needed?
Potentially, you can have a mix of Atom and RSS elements in a single syndication feed document.
So people who use this then should always capture the previous delegate before they actually overwrite it. It's generally not something people do when we have sort of a pattern where there's a property there. There's not. I don't know if we got a common pattern where we grab the old one and then we wrap it with the new one. That's kind of. It sounds like there's going to be a pit of failure there for people.
Well, we have events for it.
Yeah.
They do it automatically.
Well, or we have things like HTTP client, right, where you have the message handler, and then the message handler is an abstraction.
Yeah, generally
you may wrap one.
Is solved by just adding a virtual method that people can override. It makes it super crisp. You can name parameters. You can access more data in the future. That is like state of the parser while it's running, or the formatter.
Yeah, the only challenge with the base type is it seems like most of these formatters are created via factories. So how do you go and create one of those?
Well, so that's why I was asking who creates one of those, and he said that the user code.
You can do it both. You can either user code can create it, but there is the formatter, but there's also a syndication feed class which will produce it.
I see. And can you somehow tell the feed class to produce it?
No. You'd have to derive that and then override the classes there to then.
Is it common that people use those feed factories?
Yes.
Yeah.
I suspect that's the most common way out. That's what I was thinking, because so they don't have to choose whether or not it's an Atom or RSS. It probably chooses for you based on the endpoint data.
Yeah. So if you use there's a load method on syndication feed where you pass it the XML and it goes ahead and looks at the beginning opening XML element and works out whether it's going to be Atom or RSS, and returns you an RSS 2.0 feed formatter or an Atom feed formatter.
And another option we have is, instead of having like those things virtual on the formatter itself, we could have a new thing called, I don't know, syndication feed parser or something, where those guys are virtual methods and you can set that whole guy. And then this way you can just do the normal delegation, right?
Okay, yeah. And then we could design an easy way to change those. We could just basically put multiple of those in an array and we just walk the chain.
Yep, that's one way of doing it.
So Shin, do you remember when you use the load on syndication feed, whether it pre-passes, whether it consumes the whole document before it returns it to you?
Sorry?
So you do syndication feed.load, and then it returns you a class derived from syndication feed formatter.
Yeah.
When you get the class back, has it already consumed?
No.
It hasn't consumed it yet.
Right.
Okay, so we could have a property. So we need a property then to switch it out, because we couldn't do it on a constructor or anything. Else we'd be touching lots of APIs, like the load API on syndication feed.
Yeah, the load API looks like it actually creates an Atom feeder, and then it calls can read it, passing in the XML reader. And then if it can't read it, it goes and it creates an RSS2 one, asks it if it can read it, and then it goes.
Yeah. By the way, I don't feel strongly about any of the recommendations, but just to let you know, what are the trade-offs in this space. I think the delegate-based extensibility API is kind of not as easy to evolve going forward. You have this delegate, this is the signature, this is the property, and if you want something more in the future, you keep adding properties, and then you have a problem which one is called in which order, and
you can't overload them or things like that.
Yeah, the problem we have is syndication feed will produce one, and so if you derive it, then you can't you can't use it. You'd have to then write your own syndication feed class.
Well, so that's what Imo was saying. To work around this problem, you can have basically a type called parser, and you basically implement the parser abstraction, and then you add it to the property.
So
that helps you a lot. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it does help a bit. Because you know it's easier to chain them. You can chain them actually. You can add APIs to the parser. Like you can add more. Let's say in the future this I should. It would be so nice to know the name of some element higher up, not just those 2-3 strings. Well, you can add a field to this parser thing and set it right before you call it.
You'd have difficulty with that way the parser works. You'd have to do a massive redesign to be able to get that kind of functionality. It just worries about its current locality in the XML document.
That was just an example. I mean, I'm saying you can basically add properties and fields and whatnot to the parser. You can add new methods to the parser. Versus once you expose this delegate, that's your method. You can add more.
There's nothing wrong with actually considering this an event for this as well. It's basically a parse. If your default parsing didn't work, then you can fire an event saying parse the date. The handler can have the extra pieces of information you need.
I don't think it's a bad idea trying the default parser first, and only if it doesn't work, calling, because you could have a failure mode where the parser is incorrectly parsing but believes it's correct, it's succeeded.
How would you handle that in a delegate case? Because you're still going to want to call the base one, I'm guessing.
You can decide if to call the base one first, or if you first execute your logic, right? So.
Yeah. So.
Well, how do you decide?
Well, you can decide in your code, in your own delegate. I decide, like, first I'm going to try parse, and if it fails, I'm going to call my base, or whatever was there before.
Oh, so you call the delegate first?
Well, we just call the delegate, and so if the customer wants to completely override it,
I see.
So it's up to you as a customer, as an extender, to do the chaining, right?
Yeah, I thought we were before discussing it, and somebody said that first the built-in code runs, and then the delegate at the end, and if it fails.
No.
It's okay.
It's always going through this delegate.
It's the whole thing.
I'm not worried much about the extensibility of the delegates, and I think it's pretty, advanced scenario anyway. But Christoph has good points that it's more future extensibility and providing more information or adding one more parser and things that we lock ourselves quite a lot with this pattern.
And one other option we have is, instead of having literally a normal property on it, we could just make it a collection where you can just call add, and the default one is in there, and you can remove it if you really wanted to. That's the one that's
it doesn't allow you to reorder it per se.
Well, it's a collection, right? You can order it any way you want.
You don't need to do that with delegates. Delegates are multi-delegates by default, and you can.
Yeah, but those are really hard to control the order because you basically have to two-array them and then somehow get a delegate back that is the array. Like it seems a bit weird.
You have to chain them yourself, though.
Yeah.
You have to call them exclusively.
I guess it would work. Yeah. I mean, if it were going down that path, I would probably just fold it together into one abstraction and then have an array of that abstraction. And that handles all parsing things you have.
Keep in mind that the complexity that you just mentioned is only if you want to inject yourself in the middle of a delegate chain. Adding yourself to the beginning or the end is one line of code.
Yeah. How do you add yourself to the beginning?
Delegate dot combine, put your delegate first, and then the existing delegate is the second parameter.
Oh, because you have to the combine one.
Yeah.
That's true, yeah. If we depend on that, then it's the same thing.
So switching gears a little, I'm curious about the first sentence, which is you're planning to add this for core only, not standard or .NET Desktop framework. Is there a reason?
So we don't have plan to add this property for desktop, right? For now, we are on.
But you are open to eventually port it to desktop if there's a vehicle and everything, right?
Yes.
There's nothing preventing us from
No.
that.
Yeah, generally speaking, like the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to diverge, right? Like, I mean, we will diverge in the sense that, we cannot version everything simultaneously, but we don't want to basically have fork in the road where a framework goes down one path and core goes down another path when you have the same feature in just different API shapes, right? That would be bad. So basically that means whenever we design, we have to be able to say, oh, we could port it back to desktop if we don't do something that we know wouldn't work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the nodes that I have. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I absolutely agree on the first one. It's just, it was just trying to go with convention.
Not everything is set to guidelines yet, right? You are hitting just the corner cases.
Yeah, so that's part of what this is about. I like the XML qualified name. I did actually think about that, just couldn't remember the name of the class which combines them.
I think that's the name. I may have it wrong, but like if you just look at the reader, what the reader gives you, like whatever that thing is.
No, the reader gives you a separate. There's two properties, which is the
namespace
and the name, and then the APIs on XML Reader take a namespace and a local name. That's where I went looking.
Where does syndication feed formatter live on core, assembly-wise?
System service model does syndication.
So it already depends on everything, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that would mean we should be able to take a dependency on that thing then. It comes from XML DOM.
Oh, that's probably why. I'm used to the XML Reader world and not the X document world.
Well, I think XML qualified name is the old XML DOM API. There's also an X document one, but that thing is called XName, and that you can convert from string directly to an XName. And XName is slightly nicer than XML qualified name, but I thought that XML qualified name is already part of the reader APIs. If it's not, yeah, just pick whatever feels natural.
Yeah.
Do you have any way to express your concerns with the extensibility? I think I just mentioned somewhere in the virtual method.
Yeah, as I said, so I would definitely not do the generic funcs. I would either do the delegates, the specific delegates, or the base type. You just inherit from a base type and you add a bunch of those to an array or a list, and then you call them repeatedly. They have method try parse. So if you cannot parse, you just return false. Then you call them in a loop. At the end, you can throw the same exception every single time. For example, one additional problem that the delegate solution has, since at the end of the delegate, it's user code running, they can be throwing random exceptions, and then higher up code will be getting random exceptions depending who wrote the code.
And we handle that by if the parser throws, we record that, and then when it comes to actually accessing the property where it had been set, we rethrow it at that point.
I see.
Because another problem with the feed formatter has been, if you have an exception, historically it's just failed, it stops, and like you have one date which is bad, you can't process your whole document.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about, so what do you think about having named delegates with a Boolean response and an as Levi said, it's easy to add yourself to the end or to the beginning of a chain with a delegate.
So yeah, so long that you guys have to actually call the guy then also in that way, right? Yeah. Otherwise you would just call the first one and then nothing happens, right?
We can just create an internal helper, we just call and
yeah. And then basically the contract would be you take the first that gives you true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would work.
What would be the type again?
All delegates are multicast delegates.
Fair enough.
So someone can either replace it, or if they want to do something.
Or with the combining and stuff.
So combining, you just say plus equal to my new delegate, and it just will do it.
Yeah, just consider that I'm not sure that people get that idea very quickly. Like usually they would just do plus equals on whatever the thing is, and if you make it an event, you can only do plus equals. If you make it a property that is of the type delegate, they would just set the thing, replace the thing that's in there, right?
Yeah.
And then, so the question is like, how do you communicate to your customers that they probably want to chain that because they probably want to use your default parsers?
Well, these properties are going to
the ones that they want to provide.
We're going to need documentation for these properties, so you put it in documentation with sample code showing how to do it. And I know, at least with WCF, we've used unit tests as best practice sample codes to provide to customers. So if there's any question, we just point them there and say, "No, this is how you should do it."
No, you want to prevent questions. You want to answer that before the questions arise, right?
Yeah, that's a documentation thing. And I really don't think we would have a scenario where someone would want to insert in the middle, because they would get a feed formatter with just one on it to begin with, and so if they got their own things that they want to put in to it, just with the combine or the plus equals, you can order them perfectly however you want without doing anything tricky.
Yeah, we just write the thing that. So I don't disagree with you. All I would say is that people don't tend to read documentation before they use an API. They try to make sense of it by themselves. And if I had to guess, they probably have a bug somewhere in their RSS feed today. They write their parsing code that addresses the one bug. They run the thing again. It works. And then 3 months later, they realize, I regressed something else because now I can no longer parse the other formats. Right? It's not necessarily obvious when you replace the built-in one that you just didn't chain it correctly, right?
Yeah.
Versus if you have a virtual method, it's kind of natural that, I didn't call the base. I mean, it's kind of like the normal way of doing things, right? So this is like delegate lists, like that they are multicast to begin with. It's not necessarily something that people have.
So what do you think about if there's only one set on there, and it's their own one? We have an implicit run hours last if there's fails.
I think that would work. The only problem with that is that if you do it this way, you basically give up the control on the customer side to replace prepend or append, which may be okay, right?
Why? It's only if they don't run hours that we would.
How would you know that?
So we're going through them, and we've got a static. This is our default one, so we just compare it. Is this delegate this? Yes. Then we know that we've run our default one.
No, what I meant is like you can have code logic along the lines of like if it's not your one, run your cached one first and then run the customer one. But that means the customer can't control whether it runs before or after their own.
No, saying if our one is missing from the multicast delegate,
right?
We run the customer, we run whatever the customer's got,
right.
And if it doesn't succeed in passing, we always try ours.
As a fallback. Use the default as a fallback.
Yeah, use it as a fallback if they haven't got it already in their ordering.
I guess what I'm trying to say is like I understand that part. All I'm saying is that it just means that the customer doesn't have control whether yours runs before or after, right?
Well, because they chose to override that.
Saying they really want to run.
If they want to run ours first,
they just do it, and then you ran, and then you don't have to do it again.
Yeah,
I guess that's fair.
Yeah, because if they want to have ours run first, then they can do an append of theirs after ours. And if they want theirs to run first, they can do a prepend or just a straight out replace.
Fair enough, that works.
Because, once we've done with everything they've specified, and if it still hasn't passed, there's no harm in them saying, let's run ours, just to,
On the other hand, we're trying to kind of compensate. By the way, if we have the virtuals, will we have troubles actually with multiple... If there are multiple people trying to, add custom parsers. We will, right?
There's a list.
They have to know about each other.
They call add, and they are called in order. So.
With the virtuals, where do you call add? Oh, hey, here's my parser.
Yeah.
Add one more.
Yeah.
'Cause it's a list.
But if each of them will call the base, they will.
There's no calling a base. There's first parser in the list is their parser, and then you can rearrange the list however you want.
You would have like really wrapper of the list, wrapping a list basically.
No, there would be a property called parsers, and it returns a list of parser or URI parser, and you can keep adding stuff to it.
Okay, the argument with the virtuals, like having a class that you can inherit, one of the key values was that you can call your base, right? As well, which is the default parser.
Well, if we go with so initially we were talking about just having virtual method on the syndication formatter. Yes, in the collection of parsers thing, there's no reason for you to call base.
I see.
Base it's a pure abstract class.
Fair enough.
The base behavior is just the first item in the list.
So we're basically making rich delegates, with a class, kinda.
But then the question is it's just redoing the multicast delegate functionality, but making the API surface slightly more obvious.
Yeah, that's exactly what it does. I mean, like the fact that delegates are multicast, like I wouldn't say people get that necessarily. Like that's.
Then what's the point of multicast delegates?
Well, you could argue that the whole design is not the best one, which I would agree with. But like that's what we have, right? Okay. So like the question is, given an API surface, like can people look at it and know what they're expected to do, right? And the question is, if I see a property that is a getter and setter, like I usually don't assume that I, mess with the state and insert myself in the middle necessarily, right? Because I usually think of delegates as things you set, not as things you inject yourself somewhere into it, right? Like usually for events, it's kind of clear because you have no choice. There's no replacement, right? You just do plus equals or minus equals. But for settable delegates, it's like, well, you just replace the whole thing, right?
But to me, as I said, let me try to explain one more thing. Like to me, the abstract parser, the main advantage is that you can add more information. If like in the future you discover that to parse a datetime you need some additional piece of information, you cannot do it with a delegate. Those 3 strings that you pass in is all you can pass in. Okay. With an abstract class, you can add additional virtual member that has more parameters.
Okay,
and then you can dynamically check whether the customer gave you the new advanced parser, and you can pass more information to them.
Okay, so.
Well, or you have a context object which you can version over time.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say is combine to stick with a delegate, but one of the parameters be an interface which has some properties on to get this stuff from it, and then that can be versioned to add more stuff to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to avoid my and a large problem people have is having too much boilerplate code to be able to use any extensibility point. That's like its biggest.
Yeah.
That's the biggest issue that you see with, and I want to avoid going down that path. And so
you don't want to make it like 15 pipes to like call a parse method, right? Yeah.
And like a parse method should just be like it's generally going to be like 2 lines of code. It's going to be a date time parse exact with some string, and saying you have to create a class and which derives from this other one and override this property and this method. It's too heavy weight for something which is really a one-liner that someone's going to actually put in.
I guess the way I would describe it is like, well, I think what you're after is the same thing we're after, which is you want simplicity, right? And simplicity is not necessarily a result of how many APIs you have, because C APIs are a good example of something we usually have one method that takes 15 arguments, and there's this very tricky calling convention where if this is this and this is that, then this happens or this. So like you have this simple model is super complicated, right? And I'm feeling like this is going down a very similar path where you say, well, in order to chain, there's this very specific way to do it, which is not necessarily very obvious, right? Versus Another design may have, let's say, twice the number of APIs because it's 2 methods or it's one method and a type. But it may lead itself to like completely obvious code that you have to write because it just fits in what your mental model is, right? And I mean, I don't think we have the perfect answer right now, but I think the idea is that that's basically something you should think about and say like start writing some sample code against that, and like try to figure out for yourself like, oh, is this the code I would write the first time? And if the answer is most likely no, then you probably have the wrong APIs, right? And like that's I think kind of like the bar from a simplicity standpoint. But I totally get the point of like the more data you push in, like the more objects you have to allocate. Like parsing is also more expensive and all of that. So there clearly is a trade-off somewhere. But
I've got no problem with us having more classes or interfaces. It's customers having. Customers should only have to write the amount of code needed to get the job done. And in this case, it's a one-liner to write a parser. So, what about having a... No, because you're right about the multiclass delegates are non-intuitive.
Right.
How to use correctly.
We have community recommendations. So what about a combination of property date parser and a default syndication date parser with virtual methods? So I think the virtual methods we killed because there are cases when you cannot override, right? Why not events? Then you have both delegates and can override if needed.
Why not what, sorry?
Why not events?
Events you can't really override if you're already the default parser is already there. So
the thing with events is you can only append. Like there's no prepend.
You can inherit from default state parser and inject the class in the property.
Yeah, that's what we said originally. That seems to me like the closest thing for something that gives you both.
So what about?
So public event handler datetime parser and protected virtual on datetime parse. And like how you can inject a custom XML URL resolver into XML reader.
You mean passing it into the instance of the syndication feed formatter? I'm not quite sure I understand the suggestion.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think requiring it to be a virtual something which someone overwrites is a no-go because syndication feed instantiates these, and so you've got no control over what type's being instantiated. I think there's strong merit to having either an abstract class or an interface which has properties on it which people can actually...
Well, so you could do just a simple struct. Forget about the interface or abstract class. Just have a simple struct. Today has those 3 fields.
Structs don't version.
Well, you're advocating event args at this point.
What?
Basically.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the reason we have event args. What do you mean structs don't version?
If you are passing it to if you get a newer version of it being passed to an existing filed library, then isn't there problems with if you're not...
They don't inherit, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well
you can't inherit with structs, and so versioning, you can't create a new version which inherits from a...
You can just add a new field to a struct. It's fine. It's not like Win32 where it breaks. Like the jitter makes everything work.
Yeah, we don't have... Like the size of structs is not a
fixed value
contract.
Binary. It's not part of the binary contract.
We're not going to problem with ready to run stuff. With engine.
Well, for a given version of the framework, it's stable, right?
If you change code, you have problems with engine. So, like, unless you don't change anything in the library, yes, then you don't engine. Otherwise, you engine and then engineing this one.
No, ready to run is supposed to...
Ready to run is version resilient, so it's gonna make sure that it takes the right version size of the classes and structs.
Okay.
We add fields to structs all the time.
Okay.
We never break customers.
So maybe for next time, like if you guys can look at the option of the of the class or struct or something, and let's look at those 2 proposals, how they look, how ugly, how the usage, and then we can decide based on that.
Do we want to do another session, or we just agree? Like, what do we like?
So my preference at this point with all this feedback would be: keep the idea of a named delegate, but turn it into a list because multicast delegates are non-intuitive, and take out those parameters of the things being passed in and have either a struct or an interface being passed where then they can go and retrieve that from it, which gives a versioning capability and means your delegate definition is stable even if you add more stuff.
So I like the struct idea. I'm not sure about delegates and a list, because it's a weird combination. Like, we either do delegates or we do a list of, like, parsers. We don't, because it would be a third party. Like, we basically said, hey, we don't like how delegates chain. Let's invent a new way of chaining delegates. Let's have a list of those, and then we call them, like, it's it's a new thing in .NET. We don't do it. We either kind of accept the negatives of delegates, or we do something else, like a list of parsers.
When you could have a single type called, like, parser, right, that has two methods on it, right, like the parse datetime, the parse other thing, and you set this as a property on the syndication feed, right, and people would just derive from that guy, add their own stuff on it, and so you get the chaining by you override the parser, you call base at the time you want.
I'll still come back to...
But it doesn't chain with multiple providers, right? Is that the scenario?
No, it does, because basically you derive from the type. If you want to chain in 5 other things, it works like any other abstraction where you basically take in the other guys, have them as field, and you call them when you want to call them, right? Like, it's exactly as any other wrapping abstraction.
It still comes back to...
So let's say if you...
But in wrapping abstractions, I have to know everyone.
No. You can just say...
Oh, sorry, wrapping. Inheriting, that's what I meant. Yes.
So, but there's only one you inherit from, right? And, like, the one gives you the
default.
The default, right?
Yeah.
And you can control whether you want to call the default or not by calling base or don't call base, right? If you want to compose with 5 other things, yes, you write a generic type.
What's weird? That's weird that each of them will probably call the default, right? So that's what kind of breaks out. If you decide that I don't want to call my default, but I'm wrapping someone who decides to call the default, like you're...
That's fine, because it's a normal chain, right?
Equal base dot something. And so if you then deriving something which isn't the default, so you got a base class and you've derived that to have a new one, and then someone derives that, they call base.
But they have to know about each other at build time, right? I'm more talking about, like, you have like 2 libraries, each of them inherited, which each of them have, like, something, and they want to both compose.
But also it still comes back to the, for something which the implementation will only be like 1 line of code.
Right.
How much code does someone have to write to be able to execute that 1 line of code? And this solution's...
That is true. Although, like, this is why we said earlier, like, it's a bit hard to judge for sample code. I'm somewhat suspicious that, if you look at even signatures like this, like, there's probably not much thing that is actually literally a 1 line of code. Like, at least some if checks. Like, it probably is like on the order of, let's say, 5 to 10 lines of code.
You have to capture the other parser.
Yeah, you should probably catch an exception, do something, and
to capture the existing parser, I could do you capture existing parser into temporary variable 1 line of code. Then you have a closure defined where you're setting it to equals, and then you do your
with the exception block, with the delegation to the other one, right? Like, I mean,
it's pretty clear that we can use some sample code here to help.
Yeah.
I'm willing to get, like, it's, as I said, like, it's probably not 100 lines of code, but it's probably not 1 line of code. Like, it will be multiple lines. At which point the question is, going from 5 to 8, seems like not such a big deal. Going from 1 to 5, okay, that's a bigger jump than from 5 to 8, right?
I think if the parsers in real life were just 1-liners, then I would say, yeah, your argument is strong.
Well,
but I'm also with you. I'm a bit skeptical that the parser for a datetime would be a 1-liner.
If you go by what the spec says, it is a 1-liner. As they're only not a 1-liner because people deviate from the spec.
Exactly, but if the feed actually has a spec compliant datetime, then you don't need to do anything because presumably you parse the spec one. Okay, well then this extensibility point is for like wacky cases, and then is it ever gonna be 1-liner? The wacky case? No.
The parser itself, right?
Yeah, it could be because like someone could have an ISO 8601 variant where they don't put a T and they put a space in. I've seen that in some. And that's just 1-liner. It should just be a format string for a lot of them. Most of them are going to be, they are still a standard, but but they're just a different standard. And a different standard is going to be a one-liner because it should fit into our date-time passing format strings.
I see. So you don't, you only, by default, you parse a subset of date type.
There are a million different date-time formats. There's JSON ones, there's ISO 8601, there's 3 different RFC versions, and we do a bunch. We do the ones which are defined in the standard, and a couple of extra variants of it, but we can't come up with every single one there is.
So which ones that are built into the BCL you don't attempt to parse?
When you say built into the BCL,
Like
the BCL has you can do HH colon MM. You can. It's free form.
Custom formats. You build
they're all custom
okay,
formats.
Okay.
But the it's standard stuff.
I understand.
I mean, presumably most of the format string, right? Which that the operation itself is a one-liner, yes. But like as I said, the problem is not that, right? The problem is the policy around, okay, this is my parsing code. When do I dispatch to the built-in one? Do I try it before? Do I try it after? Like, is it an if check with a bool, with an out, or is it like a try catch? And like that's always on the order of
Yeah, well, if we switch it to, I agree that we should switch it to having a Boolean response code and not use a try catch. Then you shouldn't. If they're calling a default one, they shouldn't have need a try catch because we're not going to throw. It'll just be if try pass exact, otherwise call the inner one. But if it's a multicast delegate, then you don't even need to do that. You just return your Boolean true or false and do your plus equal or dot combine.
All right. So
that may be reasonable. I mean, the question is what happens when you have to handle these guys, right? But then it gets a bit more interesting. But yeah.
So I would like to avoid sending them back and going back and forth, so they have to come here again. Can we just give them some parameters and let them choose the rest?
That's kind of what I try to do here. To basically say here's the kind of things that we brought up as trade-offs, right? And to me, I think the number one thing that I think we should have is sample code with the API, right? And then see, okay, do we like that outcome?
Maybe we can do it offline.
Yeah, if we can.
Ideally, we should.
I would like to see what are we comparing?
Should be able to just update the thread and then.
We have a pull request. We do have pull request with actual tests in it as well for this feature. So when we go offline,
write the docs.
Yeah. We can point to it from here, I say. Because
Copy them here.
So we're saying no to the idea of a list of delegates. How do we feel about multicast delegates?
I think it's fine. They have negatives, but we have them. And I also think that the non-trivial chaining will be so rare that it is a negative, but most people will just combine in whatever.
Most people will probably won't even use the plus equal. They'll just replace it with one, which then capture the existing one and then create a closure and call the inner one. But most people probably chain like that rather than a delegate.combine or a plus equal. That's my feel.
So I think we should just either go with standard multicast delegate or event as struct, or this abstraction and a list of those. And I think it's up to you. Just update the API and show us some code samples of a real parser that actually does something interesting.
Makes sense.
Sounds good?
Yeah.
Right.
If you can update this today, we can look through it today and kind of sign off through email or through online or through GitHub.
All right, then I think we're done with this one. Sweet. You're free to stick around or leave when you want to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. We only have 1 hour now, but I think that should be enough for the first pass. So do you want to give some overview?
Yeah, sure. So in order to support some machine learning and AI scenarios in .NET, kind of the first container of data, mostly used for numbers, basically. And so a tensor, a multi-dimensional data is like, a 1 dimension is a vector or a list kind of thing. 2 dimensions is a matrix. 3 dimensions is a cube. Tensor is the term for the abstraction over top of, n dimensions of this data. And so the idea is like all these machine learning libraries kind of have their own types for this is what I think is a matrix, this is what I think is a matrix, and in order to like interop between, say, things like math.net and CNTK, people have to copy the data from one format to the other. So the idea is to make a BCL type that people can use, that's like an exchange type that everybody kind of agrees on. And so we don't have to do this copying around. It's also tuned for interop with native scenarios as well. So if you have a native library that takes matrix data, you can interop tensor data with it without doing the copying. Similarly, if you have a native library that returns native memory that has the matrix data in it, you can make a tensor that wraps over top of that native memory without doing the copying.
Yeah, the last one is really the huge part, because I think the other part that is worth mentioning is that these tensors tend to be large. Like, we don't talk about arrays that have like maybe a few thousand elements. We talk about things that have a few thousand elements per dimension times like 25 dimensions or something like that, right? And so these things tend to be, not like, a few hundred bytes. They tend to be more like in a few thousand.
Right, like a decent example to think about is an image, right? And if you have 100 by 100 pixel image, so 100 by 100, and then every red, green, blue is a third dimension in there, right? So it's 100 times 100 times 3. And now if you want to do like video, machine learning on videos, right? You have one of these images every so often, right? So if you have a video that's a minute long and you take a picture every 2 seconds or something, things multiply really quickly in this world, and so.
It feels to me like specific interpretation on top of memory of T.
It's similar to memory of T, but it's got higher level.
Yeah, as I said, like specific interpretation of memory of T, like.
So another thing that I failed to mention in the preamble is we have dense representations of tensors. So which is kind of what we've been talking about, right? We have an array, and every element in the tensor takes up a memory slot. But then we also have sparse representation of tensors. So again, if you go back to the image, and it's like, 75% of this image is all white, but then I only have drawing on 25% of it, you can have a sparse representation that allows you to not have all the quote-unquote zero values represented in memory. You only represent what actually has values. So that's another kind of dimension here.
What's the format of that? Like, is there some industry format?
Yep. Did you hear the question?
Okay, you're back. Yep. There is a handful of industry format sparse formats. We've chosen to implement kind of two to start. One is like a super industry format called or compressed sparse column, and then the other one is a dictionary based sparse format.
We have option to extend in future to other formats. Is that correct?
Totally. Yep. That is exactly correct. Yep.
So I have a question. If we reverse stride, the default I assume is false, but it says that CNTK is using true. Shouldn't we default to what CNTK wants?
Sorry, I have a question. And then
so I was asking about the reverse stride parameter to dense tensor. Expects true. Should we reverse the default?
So what reverse stride really means is column major.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason we don't call it column major is because the word column kind of implies two dimensions, right? So reverse stride is a good thing to talk about, like whether this is a good name or not. Well, we can defer that for now. But the default of it is C style arrays are row major, right? So .NET arrays are row major.
Mm-hmm.
And so like if it feels natural that in .NET the default to be is the same as the array, because if you look through some of the APIs, there's like take an array and to tensor it. And so if the default would be that you wanted reverse stride true column major, we couldn't just take an array and to tensor it. Either you'd already have to have that array in column major format, which you probably don't have, or we'd have to copy the data out and do the formatting.
I see.
Yeah, I guess
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The meta feedback would be we should obviously choose our defaults in such a way that common operations do not require crazy gymnastics, right? Either for interop with the majority of the libraries or, with our normal data structures like arrays, right? But there's clearly some tension because there's not a single format to rule them all. So it is something that we need to probably look at and compare and look at how many operations or copies or translations we would need in common cases.
Right. So, I mean, kind of just to reiterate, .NET, C-style arrays are row major. Python ND array defaults to row major.
Yeah, it makes sense. It answered .NET arrays, not CNTK, and makes sense.
I have to repeat that. All right, good.
The only thing that he said, really.
So I put two scenarios here. The first usage scenario is basically some code that we presented at Connect. If you watched any of the Connect keynotes, there was the MNIST. You draw a digit, and then this thing tells you what digit you drew. So this is the code that takes a bitmap, basically the drawing on the screen, and then turns it into tensor data. And so kind of the first lines is getting the width and the height of what you want the image to be, and then you resize that image. So that's kind of the first three lines aren't really the important stuff. The first line that's important is the new dense tensor of floats that takes in the dimensions you want, and then this optional Boolean that's whether you want reverse stride or not, basically row major or column major. And then start looping over width and height and getting the pixels for each color, converting them into a grayscale, and then putting them into the tensor, and then returning the tensor. And so that comment about turning the black background into the white digit, that's just because the image comes in with black writing on a white background, but the learning model is, a black background with a white writing. So that's just also kind of more details. That's not important to API. The second scenario is something that I played around with. There's old libraries like LawPack or Linear Algebra Pack is a library that was originally written in like Fortran and then eventually kind of modernized in the 90s. And so here it's taking two dense tensors, A and B, and then solving for x in the equation that's in the summary. So A times x equals B, and solve for x. So it's basically B divided by A. But you don't really divide matrices. So anyway, what this is showing is being able to take a tensor and then interop it with existing native code. Some errors checking at the top that says, this must be a matrix, it must be square. The number of rows in B has to match the number of rows in A. And then because LawPack will mutate the values in place, you actually do need to make a copy in this scenario, because the idea being the caller doesn't want A and B to change. And so in this exact scenario, but other native libraries might have, might return native memory, so you don't need to make the copies. But anyways, in this case, we do make copies for A and B, pass the pointers for those tensors into this LawPack E, I don't know how to say, but DGSV method.
Yeah, that looks pretty straightforward.
What does the reference point to? So I get that for dense tensors, if they're represented, if they're backed in memory by a multidimensional array or similar, then dangerous dependable reference will probably point to that array itself. But for sparse tensors, what would that return?
Right, like notice in this case, like the API is actually dense tensor, right?
Okay.
For sparse, you would have to have another method, right? And the native method would have to take a quote unquote compatible format of that sparse. So concretely, if the native, if you want to scroll down, we can look at, if you want to go to compressed sparse tensor, the class, so it's underneath tensor.
Before we go there, I think that the general gist is effectively, I think we expose the memory layout, right? We don't hide the memory layout from you. So like this API here, buffer, is specific to a dense tensor. Mm-hmm. Like, the other ones have other representations and they give you access whatever their representation ends up being. So when you look at the derived, like basically, as you saw earlier here, I think there's a class hierarchy involved, right? So dense tensor derives from tensor.
Right.
And so that you basically have to know what you're doing if you want to, efficiently hide them, like.
No, and I get that. I guess what my question is coming down to is, do we have APIs that look symmetric, such as some derived class stop off the boss map on dangerous dependable reference? So the APIs look the same if you're calling them on two different types, but it actually does different things under the covers. Like gives you different representations in memory.
So I think to populate the tensor data. Yeah. So if you populate the tensor, it doesn't matter which kind of tensor you use.
Right, correct. I'm talking for interop scenarios.
The moment you're doing interop, I think there's no escape. Like the native code expects some format.
So some other representations, for example, don't have a single buffer. They have like 3 different buffers because they represent, I don't know, the coefficient, the coordinates that are filled and something like that, right? What is a bit weird here is that, like, why is clone? Why do I have to cast the clone result?
Because iClonable returns an object.
Yeah, but like it's your own method, you don't have to satisfy the interface.
Well, because the abstract tensor clone returns tensor of t. So I mean, we could make new clone methods on dense tensor, compressed sparse tensor,
which I think makes more sense because that seems like a bit weird that I have to like.
Yeah, I would definitely do it,
and I want to get back the same thing clearly, right? Like that.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want to add that into the notes, or I can write it down to new those methods.
So very high level question, like in the beginning you basically said that this is about like making the vendors port their libraries to .NET, but it all feels more like, you know, having better interop and being able to write .NET code interoping better with those libraries.
Yes, sort of.
Well, so which one is?
It's kind of, it's kind of all.
Okay.
It's kind of.
Basically, right? You know.
I won't say it doesn't
Have any machine learning types or libraries, but it's compared to other languages, .NET isn't used in the machine learning space. So the proposal is, in order to start getting .NET more involved in the machine learning space, having a type that represents multidimensional data, better multidimensional data will hopefully will spark more AI and machine learning in .NET.
So you would expect that some of those libraries might port their parts or maybe entirely into .NET. Is that fair?
I think porting.
I mean, one example is TensorFlow is a very popular machine learning library out of Google right now, right? Miguel has this repo that has TensorFlow Sharp, which is C# bindings for TensorFlow, and so it's not a rewrite completely of TensorFlow. It's bindings over top of TensorFlow.
So
similarly,
I think I'm here interop.
Yeah, but I think interop is like, if I hear interop, it's more like what the customer can do by themselves. Bindings is basically pre-canned interop code written for you.
Okay, fair enough.
So that's one side of the equation is interop. Similarly, there's many libraries in Python to do machine learning. Scikit-learn, kind of one of them, one of the more popular ones. Like, there is no interop story from .NET to Python, or at least CPython, from what I can tell. Like, I asked some people, everybody told me it doesn't work. And so in those cases where somebody who was say they were like playing, maybe they were investigating and researching in Python, and they decided, okay, I want to productize this code, but Python isn't fast enough for me. Now I want to port this into .NET. It's like, that is a scenario as well of, okay, I have this stuff in Python that I want to run in my productized app, but I can't call Python for my productized app. So I'm now porting this Python code into .NET.
Also, so I mean, in general, like I think like methods like this one here, we don't expect most customers to write. Like what we expect customers to basically use is APIs like this.
Yeah.
The question is who
So
provides.
writing the high-level code, and under the hood it calls into the low-level libraries, which are in different languages.
So right now what we provide is we don't provide anything like this. Right? We don't provide a pre-canned version to call into LAPACK, for example, right? So what we provide right now is just the exchange type plus the, being optimized for doing stuff like this. There is a general discussion right now in the machine learning space in DevDiv that, Niklas and other people are driving, is like, how far are we going with .NET? Should we as a team, for example, provide a LAPACK wrapper? Should we write our own? Should we just provide should we just work with other people the JSON.NETs of machine learning so that they can write those libraries? But the end goal is clearly in the sense that we want customers to be able to just add a NuGet package reference and just basically hack away with simple APIs that do that. And I think
productivity of C# and everything, while keeping the performance and being able to not rewrite everything.
Right. And I think this is basically the very first step. So we don't have anything like this today, but eventually the goal is to have that clearly, because APIs like this, they're not fun to call.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I kind of have both of these scenarios in this proposal. Is that top scenario is really easy to understand, and I'd expect lots of people, if they were doing machine learning in .NET, to be writing code like that, right? New up a tensor, fill it up with data, give it something. But yes, the second scenario is still important, but not as many people are going to be writing this.
Well,
but we still need to be able to do this. We still need to be able to do scenario 2.
But once we add language pinning support to spans, it will get simpler and simpler. It basically will get to a point where it depends what's the signature of the native library. If it's nice, it's gonna be nice. If it's not nice, then well, that's how the native library works. And of course, wrapper improves a lot.
Yeah.
But
I think the general problem is, I mean, like what we are going for right now, Azure and us in particular, like DevDiv, is we want to democratize the whole machine learning space, right? I mean, and so like the libraries are nice from a, if you know what the memory layout is, it all makes sense. But if you look at methods like this, like first of all, you have to have like a 5-year degree in math to understand what the fuck this thing even does. Yeah. And then secondly, like this, the calling conventions are not necessarily straightforward. So I think what these 3 lines of code look like in the grand scheme of things is almost irrelevant, right? Like all your problems are in understanding the space, right?
No, I agree. But what I was saying is, what you said would improve upon the native library, whereas I thought we are kind of discussing is the tensor API good enough? And I'm saying like once we add the pinning support, I don't think how you can make it
any better.
Yeah, for this particular sample, the rest is better than just the native signature is kind of not super self-explanatory.
So I think like Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but like I think probably we should just look at the base type and then at the derived ones, right?
Yeah, there's a I'm just going to say it because we're going to have to get to this some point. There's a very important piece at the end called range.
Oh yeah.
That's like nobody is pushing on this, and I absolutely have. In order to do tensor correctly, we need a range. We need a range type somewhere because one of the methods in tensor is slicing tensors. Right. And so the idea of slicing is give me a subset of this data, right? And in order to have a subset of an n-dimensional data, like you need a range for each dimension. So anyway, point being is I kind of want to push on range as well. In this meeting because I think it's important and it's going to take a while to get people to come to a conclusion on range.
Yeah, I think the thing with range is I think Seth had a great sample code. Like I think range on span is, you can say, is very minor syntactic sugar, right? It saves you like, I don't know, 6-7 characters in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't do much. But if you look at a tensor where you have like 6 dimensions, for example, like a very common operation that you have is that you have, when you, for example, train models, you maybe have a tensor, like a CSV file on disk or something, that effectively has the inputs and the outputs like mixed together. But then what you want to do is you want to basically take the tensor that you have and get a new tensor that only has basically, the last column. Another tensor that only has the first 2 columns. You want to project pieces out, essentially. And so if you look at code that does that for like 3 or 4 dimensions, you say new range, 1, 2 or something. You also have to represent that you want to say take everything from the minimum to a maximum value, or starting from a value to the other one. There's like so many combinations that you talk about a line that has like 100 characters, which in Python, because they have syntax, is like 5 characters. And you look at it, it immediately makes sense. So this is where the thing really, is no longer a minor syntactic sugar. It really makes a difference from.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and even how would you do it? So if you want to go to the slice method real quick.
Where is it?
Search for range.
I guess that is fair.
Yeah.
So you need like a range is, let's just say a start and an end,
right?
Pair of ints. Like, well, how do you make this API? How do you say I want a list of a start and a pair of start and ends? It's like, well, either you got to have a tuple of ints, or you need some type, right? Because you need to have a list of these types.
Yep.
So slice on span, because span is only 1 dimension, you only need 2 ints. But since we're now n dimensions, it's like, well, now you need n 2 ints. So how do you have to represent that some way?
We all agree.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not seeing nodding because I can't see. So
just watch this.
Good.
No. YouTube.
So the proposal, just to kind of close out on this on range, the proposal that I'm putting forward is system.range in system.memory NuGet package.
So let me give people some background, because I've been working with both Eric and we talked to Jared and some other people, kind of some of the trade-offs of things that we discussed regarding range. So one question is range of ints or longs? So for example, a range of ints does not work for things like pipelines. It's not clear whether it works for if we make it long, it theoretically can work for pipelines. It's just working with ranges so large that they don't fit in int is kind of the wrong thing to do. So you can have a signature that lets you advance a pipeline by 4 gigabytes, but it's gonna be like kind of not the right thing to do. But having said that, there are some scenarios where like you run out of space in int for like multi-segmented buffers. Second thing is somebody commented from the community that they wanted to make range of t, so you can kind of
Any type.
You can put any type. Range of t has the problem that suddenly the syntax is kind of compare the t's, and now the types need to be comparable. Like there are some other negatives.
Well, if you have an operator plus and a comparison, you could theoretically make it work.
Maybe.
Just keep calling it in a loop until it's
more complicated.
Yeah.
The nice thing about range, just based on ints, it's so simple. We know that it's gonna work, and there are like it's.
Can you contrast it to why we wouldn't just use tuple? Tuple event.
Why not tuple?
Yeah.
Well, so another one, it's related. I'm going to answer your question. So the C# compiler wants to add syntax. Basically, if you type open square bracket number, there's something like this here.
New range syntax.
Yep, if you click that link, if you click the link in the details,
they will create a value of this type, range type, so you can just have it in the signature and then use this type, then use the syntax. For this to work with tuples, it would probably be a bit strange. We would have now two different syntaxes for tuple, like the parentheses syntax, and now
we already have language support for it, but if they want to have specific support for range, is a different question.
So
they also talk about how to handle longs if you scroll down. The idea is there's multiple.
Yeah, so this is some of the background. I did kind of conclude that I think we should start with simple int-based range, and if we have a need for longs, we just add longer range, and then pipelines use longer range, and then language is very general. You just apply some attribute to your type that has two fields, and the language just sends those two fields to whatever you put in the square brackets.
And the idea is if your type wants to support range with longs, you could put both. You'd have methods that take both.
Right. And also it's a bit more efficient if it's a small struct with ints than longs, and so on and so on. So now the location of the type. Why system memory?
So a couple reasons. Well, a couple reasons that it's not in the same package as tensor is because one is I don't see tensor going in box anytime soon. I think it should ship in its own library kind of for a while, probably indefinitely. So system memory is brand new is another reason that I picked that one, and so adding types into it now versus some other library, some other package. And then 3, tensor already has a dependency on system memory, and so tensor wants to be net standard 1.1 and run, on .NET Core 2.0, 2.1 desktop, UWP, Xamarin, like basically anywhere, right? And
Yes.
What if we had it? We'd use range and
Yes.
as well.
Well, I was definitely not proposing that we put range in tensor, but I was thinking maybe we just put it in,
say it again.
system runtime. But then
If it's in system runtime, how
Yes.
would tensor work on .NET 4.6 or 4.6.1?
correct. So I understand that.
If we make it part of OOP, eventually system memory will have to depend on that.
Well, the one technical problem that we have is that the OOP is going inbox into 1. The question is, like, what I don't want to have is like a version into 1 where everything in memory is inbox but range. Right? So the question is, because then you have now it gets even more complicated. Now you have a partial.
If we put it in system memory, it would have to go inbox to 1.
Exactly. So the question is, do we have enough runway to pull that off now? Because there's a language feature that's going in there. I think I would say if we...
The language feature isn't necessarily, like, it's in proposal stage right now. There's no hard, it's going in anytime.
No, that's true. But I mean, my experience with language features is that they tend to take a long time to mature, and they do tend to change things fairly drastically along the period, right? So if we ship a version of range based on the current language proposal, and then the guys change their mind on what they can project to, and then we have to introduce a new type that is different from the one that we
With Jared, we showed him this type, and we asked him what he thinks about it, and he was optimistic. But we should probably get something in writing from them, or kind of like a bit of a formal.
Yes, like that is going to help.
Because
So, like, honestly, the worst case scenario in my mind is I ship a range in the tensor library, and then the C# API doesn't work with it.
Yeah.
Because it's not like it's not the real BCL range type. It's just some random.
the
tensor
worst
library.
scenario is we put range in system memory, and then it doesn't work for the language. Now language introduces a new range, and now system memory has a word, the range that it cannot use or shouldn't be using.
Yes.
Right. And the hope is that system memory is at least core enough that whatever they do in the language is okay. We have to make it work with system memory.
Well, that's kind of forcing their hand, right?
Yeah,
Honestly, that's what I'm doing for everybody right now. Is I'm forcing the hand because like nobody else needs this as much as tensor needs it.
so
Like we don't need the language. Span doesn't need it, right? It's like tensor needs it, but everybody kind of wants it.
So, but that kind of speaks to the other thing, right? I mean, if we put range in tensor, like system.tensor.dll or something, right? That whole thing is in preview for a while. We can make whatever changes we want to make to those APIs. Eventually, we get a range that we really, really like that works for tensor really well, and then the language guys can add it to the language, and that may just mean that it will take us another year until this thing is stable, but then we have the best possible type, and then we can have the discussion again, where this thing ships. Because I agree with you that range at that point shouldn't ship in tensors anymore. It should actually go in box, and then we can find a home for that thing, right?
well, but then, so do you think that every single, we cannot add APIs to system memory after we inbox it?
So that's what I'm saying.
Right?
I think
Basically means that in next release we have to create yet another, because system memory became like the Uber library for
dumping around.
it basically became system.ub for .NET Core 2.1.
All of it is around memory, around span, right?
Well, it depends.
Other signal are dependencies.
Well, it depends exactly what you mean by around.
Yeah.
Because there are like UTF-8 parsers and formatters, and yes, they use span just like many APIs use arrays. So like all the APIs in .NET Framework are around arrays.
But
you know what I'm saying.
span is a new thing, and this is the funnel of the span, right? It's not that we have random things that are entirely
let's not talk too much about that. I think the takeaway for the range thing is like tensors absolutely need a range. We need to make sure that the design that we have works for C# as well as for tensors. And then the question is, can we get our ducks in a row so we can ship the whole fucker in 2.1? Because it will be the easiest from an UBIC standpoint. If we can't ship it in 2.1, we have to create yet another assembly somewhere where we can put whatever the range type ends up being. Which
Eventually.
Really, well, practically, right?
I would just try to get the language people to look at it very quickly.
Because we will support tensors out of band on full framework.
Yes, and
If we
and the best case forever, right? So
if we can ship an out of band version of range to .NET framework, it means tensors will be substantially less.
so it cannot be actually in the same DLL as tensors.
Well, not long term. It could be. I mean, that could be a home for it in the U. But again, like the reason I don't like it because it basically turns tensors into this partial U. Because now eventually you have to type forward it down somewhere, in which case you have all the problems of partial OOP. So I would really, really try hard to keep tensors a pure OOP, like similar to immutable. I would not try to put types in there that go in blocks. That would be terrible.
How I think about it is you have tensors.
Yep.
Then you have range.
Yep.
And the question is like, is it sitting on top of the platform for some while and like merging? Like so. You basically say like, hey, this is the pure OOPness, and it has dependencies on some OOP that will eventually come into the platform.
And realistically, the thing for range that controls that is, can we get it dumping one of the other types, and then nothing bad happens? If we can, then we have to find yet another assembly for that fucker, and I would try to avoid that if possible.
Fair enough.
So can we just send the type to the language people and say we want to ship it in 2.1? Can you
sign off on the design?
Sign off on the design.
Yeah, Eric, like, do you think the have
literally I copied this from that proposal and I just removed IEnumerable from range because I didn't need it.
Yeah, but is that shape right now sufficient? Because there was this other thing that we talked about, like how do you. What I'm trying to say was, is this shape you currently have sufficient? Because I remember from the discussion with Seth, we needed a representation for we don't have a lower bound and we don't have an upper bound.
Yeah, and I think the idea there was like a sentinel value, like -1 for start means you don't have a lower bound, and -1 for end means you don't have an upper bound.
That's the thing we need to think about, because that fucks over every comparison you have. I
well,
mean,
and also
-1 is not too bad on lower end, but it's
also it presumes that range can only be positive numbers.
Yes.
Which is not necessarily true.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's more true. Even. Yes. Yeah. So that's the design we have to think through.
This might be, I might be ignorant here, but why? How could you start negative?
Well, just like you can have offset in a stream negative.
My
So
valid
you're
range
stepping
is
out
negative
of the bounds, actually.
Because the range.
You're stepping out of the bounds of a relative position.
Yeah.
If I take range of something.
Think of a text buffer, right? You have a text buffer.
Yeah.
You have a currently selected phrase in the buffer.
Sure, and if I'm operating on some subpart, and suddenly that thing should be able to step outside.
Say 10,000.
Okay.
You select a word starting at 5,000. Now you want to do some computation that says, oh yeah, the other thing is minus 200 characters in front of your thing.
So shifted, basically.
Yes. Which is actually super common for any sort of, like what's the delta between my current caret and my target caret, right? Like if I do a translation.
For parsers, it's super useful.
Yep.
For backtracking and stuff like this. I mean,
okay, let's take it offline, but I would like to know more about the use cases.
It's not that,
it still feels wrong that smaller parts should kind of step outside of the bounds. So
it's just like I think the bottom line is like every time you have offsets in length, what you want to avoid is you want to look at code, and the code should be like very simple, like x is lower than y, right? And those invariants need to keep up as much as possible. And the more special cases you add, where you say, oh, it could be negative, or like that, like you have these more like special conditions. And I think over history has proven that if you have negative offsets, you tend to have fewer special cases, and stuff just plays out usually. As soon as you do this thing where you say, oh, negative means it's a bad value, like bad things tend to happen.
So you bring up a good point, is that it's not start and length. It's start and end.
That's also true. Yeah, we need to also agree on what we want the semantics to be here.
I spoke to Ashley offline, and she said, like, they're pretty hard on it's not going to be start and length from the language side.
I mean, it would be trivial to add a property called length, right? Which gives you effectively whatever the delta is, right? I mean,
yes,
and
very useful.
I mean, pretty much all range types I've ever seen had start and end length, because depending on what you do is the one is more convenient than the other. Like,
Well,
the problem with end also is like, is it inclusive or is it exclusive? And you don't know, right?
Exclusive, otherwise bad things happen.
Yeah.
Well, that's also true. Yes.
Yeah, but then the question is, what is the language syntax map to? So it would map to start and end.
See, but this is the difference between different languages. Like, I think in Python they have ... and then they have colon, and one means one means the other. I forget which one it is. I think the colon one is end and the ... is length. No, I think I don't know. One of the
I feel like we need to support length because we have so many APIs already in the framework that operate on length. Porting code to something with ranges without having ability to basically say start and length will be just really bad.
Well, it also depends on what that is. I mean, I think the biggest problem is usually constructors where you only see two ints, you don't know what they are. Like the way they've done it in VS is that their text range thingy basically takes start and length. And then you also have a static method called from bounds. So you can say text span from bounds and you say start end. And like quite frankly, as long as we are consistent with what we have, and I agree with you, I think if we see two ints, we assume it's length. Like because we have no other APIs in Framework that take end positions. But like I think for language syntax, I mean,
the language syntax it should be start end. Like, I'm saying like 3.7. I'm not saying
sure,
they
can do the map, right?
Right, but like I mean, the question I think for syntax, I could be convinced that end is good enough because I mean, you look at their primary example here with the for loop.
1.10, right?
Yeah, like that, like. It would be really weird if this is a length, right?
Yeah.
But this is okay. Exactly. Let's not optimize for like a stupid example that prints numbers from 0 to 10.
Say stupid, but right? I think it's the poster child for range.
It's not really a stupid example, right? Like for loops from 0 to 10 is like very classic.
Yeah.
And
really
very used all
we
over.
usually not 10, but yeah.
And is it inclusive or exclusive?
I think it's the same as for loop. It's exclusive. It goes from 0 to 9.
Yeah, I think for zero-based languages or zero-based indexes, like it has to be exclusive.
Anyway, so there's gonna be interesting discussion. So something tells me we're not gonna land this in 2.1. There's gonna be too many questions around range and stuff. So
no, okay. Make it a priority. We could pull it in. I mean, like it's just. I think so far we just said.
Go for it. Now let's prepare the disaster plan. What we said that tensor will be. Or do we want to ship it like this is the final thingy?
First of all, let Eric speak again. I would say let's not design the thing yet because to me that's almost a different thing. I mean, I would say okay, duly noted. We need to figure out what range has to do and how we ship it. I think we have covered that part. The other question is, are we happy with the general API?
Well, but I think what Karel was saying is, sure, let's go for it. Try to make it work for 2.1. In case it doesn't work,
yes,
10% case. Like in case we cannot make it work, what do we do? And I think the only reasonable answer right now is we keep it in tensors, and the implication is we will have another package.
But we keep the tensors as preview. Which means that we can break.
No. But at some we need to add, when language syntax is added, we will want range in the platform.
Yes.
So we will have to.
That's where we're gonna break the tensor out of the preview, make it real.
No. Forget about the tensor. Tensor, we literally don't care what happens with tensor. What do we do with the range at that point when we want the language?
It has to ship as a loop.
Yeah, exactly. It has to keep shipping as a loop and be in platform.
Yes. And either we're gonna make it into system memory in time for 2.1.
No, we cannot. Well,
Maybe.
okay, yes. So, but now we are discussing the contingency plan. If it doesn't work for system memory 2.1, we basically are signing up to have additional OOB that is implied in the future.
To be fair though, like we have this problem with I think it would be convenient for us to add it to 2.1. If we can add it to 2.1, I don't think anything bad happens because this is not the last language feature that we ship, right? Like there will be other things that have the exact same characteristics as range.
Well, but I thought we said from now on all the kind of OOBs that we know that we're gonna have to implant, we have a meeting and review, and we kind of basically we don't do it very reversely.
Yes.
Okay, so let's not.
That's what I'm saying. To me, the number one goal will be we should get it into 1 because the cost is high. If we can't make it into 1, I would honestly say to me range is almost in the same range as tuples, right? It's like a feature that we really, really, really want to get out of band because we really, really want to support full framework as is. And we can probably, based on our experience with tuples, sketch what the cost would be. Now the question is, do we actually care? Or do we say, oh, too bad we didn't make it for 2.1, so we'll be only in core, and too bad if you're running on standard or full framework, you don't get it. There could be a output of that.
But I would say if that's the decision, we shouldn't be making it in this meeting. We should talk to Peter and others. And
my question more on that.
For tensor, it's not okay to just say this only works in .NET Core 2.1.
Yeah.
Which basically means we are.
That's a non-starter for tensor. It has to work.
But here's my question was are we forced or do we plan to ship tensors as RTM quality or something like final non-preview during 2.1 time frame?
Yes, that was the plan, or that is the proposal.
Okay, that breaks.
This ships.
Yes.
This ships a stable version with .NET Core 2.1.
I see. I didn't get that. So okay, that breaks my plan.
We can change that if there's reasons.
It's a dependency.
So why does tensor have to be stable in 2.1? Because the runway for 2.1 is not that long.
So, kind of the reasoning is there's some problems with uptake in tensor, right? Like nobody's going to take it as a dependency if it's in preview. And so getting feedback in users on it, it's hard right now to, especially right now when it's in CoreFX Lab, because it's like, well, we could just throw this away. So why would anybody want to even, outside of just playing with it, why would they actually want to take a dependency on it and use it?
On the uptake is the primary thing we care about, but I would disagree with you on the fact that preview is the thing that holds people back. Because we had the same experience with immutable collections where we shipped essentially a preview version for, I want to say something like 9 months. And we had a decent number of downloads, in the order of I forgot the number, but 20,000, 30,000 downloads or something. And we got a ton of feedback, and we did rev the API service as a result of that. I think the biggest problem usually is, as you said, it's a CoreFX lab. It's a bitch to set up because it's on MyGet. Usually, many of our things don't just work on full framework. They pull in 50 other packages to work on full framework. So these are all the technical problems that we usually end up having. But I think we could solve those issues regardless of whether tensor is stable or preview.
So CNTK is one of the major people we want to be able to use this, right? They ship stable packages every couple months, maybe.
Right.
They shipped a 2.0 6 months ago, and then a 2.1 4 months ago, and then a 2.2 3 months ago, and then their 2.3 20 days ago, and a 2.3.1 7 days ago. If let's just take the plan of tensor is 9 months in preview, it's they're not going to take it for their next.
My point is not so much the
3-4 versions.
I don't care about the time frame. The biggest problem usually ends up being is you have a decently sized API service. Right? We haven't really even tracked the API service yet. What I'm after is having enough traction on the API service that we know the API is good. That's really my concern. And I'm saying, given that 2.1 ships early next year, what's our chance to make enough inroads with partners in that time frame to convince ourselves that the API shape that we have is good enough? Well, I'm just questioning that that line of
But
requirement.
I didn't get, maybe that's also a confusion about dates. I don't think he was saying that it will syn ship with 2.1. It will just ship in the time frame. So 2.1 can ship, and then tensor can ship stable 2 months later.
If we want to.
So it doesn't matter. As long as range is stable, you know...
But that's why I asked earlier, like, is it about range being stable in 2.1, or is it about, like time after available for 2.1? Like, I have much...
Well, tensor has dependency on range, which means when tensor goes, stable, range has to go stable.
Yeah, I think range is one thing, because the API is so small, like, I could be convinced that it pulled this off. This one is pretty large and has a non-trivial interaction with the rest of the ecosystem. And
so, Eric, can you clarify? Is the plan to ship this stable in the 2.1 time frame, or at the time when 2.1 ships?
I mean, the current working plan was when 2.1 ships, tensor is stable as well.
So at the same time, you think it would be unreasonable to have like a month or 2 months delay?
I mean, if needed, it wouldn't be unreasonable, but I don't see what the need would be, I guess.
That's the point.
Okay. To me, it's more like, as I said, like it's validation time, right? I mean, like I highly doubt that we will be able to get a significant number of downloads and uptake to validate the design.
Agreed. Especially living in CoreFX Lab.
Yeah, so I agree with you. The minimum thing is it has to be on NuGet. It has to be an official release. Otherwise, we never get to anybody using it. And that one, I think we should do earlier rather than later. And given that it's preview, we can break any APIs we want. We can break it apart, remove, rename, whatever we want to do. But I think we need to work through a bunch of things to validate that this whole thing holds water.
By the way, I don't believe it has anything to do with CoreFX Lab. It's more NuGet versus MyGet, correct?
True, but I think we can produce signed bits out of CoreFX Lab.
We cannot what?
Produce signed bits out of CoreFX Lab.
So it's even a little bit worse.
Yeah.
So, a little bit.
But yeah. I mean, from a customer standpoint, they don't care where the source code is. But it's really about,
I get this.
You can just add
the
reference.
biggest obstacle.
Yeah.
Does
that make sense?
And how often do we ship re-release packages on NuGet?
As often as you want.
But how, in practice, how often do we?
Literally, like every time somebody wants to do it, we just do it. Like there's no schedule for that.
And in practice?
We just did a couple in the past couple months, right? Like we just did drawing as previews, and we did the compat packages, a couple versions of those, right?
So like once a month, we
once per 2 months roughly in practice, yeah. But we can pull it off, and it's not high overhead for the preview.
Yeah, for Immutable, we had some releases that were like a week apart because somebody found a critical bug and we just fixed it and uploaded a new version. Like it's not like we can ship as frequently or as infrequently as we need.
It's about investment on our side, and yes, we're committed.
So I'm not 100% committed to like Tensor has to ship stable at the same exact time .NET Core 2.1 ships RTM. But it's kind of like you have to have some sort of stake, right, to say.
But also it doesn't matter. Like, so for the purpose of the discussion of range, it doesn't matter. Basically, you want to ship before the subsequent version of .NET Core. Therefore, in .NET Core 2.1, the range needs to be there.
I mean, I think range...
You need this requirement. I'm not saying that it's doable, but I'm saying if you follow the requirements, that's the implication. Correct? Range is a general purpose type. It's not
Could you imagine 2.1.1 or something? With just range addition from servicing range?
One additional DLL that will be in place, so we can put struct with the fields. No, it just adds more complexity and DLLs.
No, it doesn't help us.
Because if we miss the 2.1 frame, it has to be OOP.
Because it means we already have to support a version of memory that is type forwarded to the platform.
Yeah,
Then it doesn't matter whether it's 2.1 or 2.2.
It doesn't help us. If we miss the 2.1 frame, we're in its own DLL.
Yes.
Okay.
Like,
good point.
Alright, who's gonna work with the language team to very quickly do the range thing?
So what we could do, I can help Eric like bring up the discussion again with Mats and see whether we can put it on the calendar. I don't know what their backlog looks like right now. I haven't attended their meetings in a while. But I mean, like, the nice thing is we don't need an end design from them. Right? We just basically need to agree on, basically, the rough corners of the design point. Right?
Well, so imagine, for example, that initially we just had a struct without I in the module of and then the language team decides that the interface is required. We cannot add the interface because we cannot add interface to packages that are being implanted.
That's what I mean by the rough design points. Right? I mean, like things like what interface it has to implement, what the shape is, how the language binds to that. I mean, those are the.
I wouldn't call it rough. It needs to be the API that they sign up to support. Otherwise, we are screwed.
They don't need to design the.
We have to have a sign off from them that when they do this language feature, this. A sign off that this type looking exactly like this will be supported in the language feature.
Like to just problems in the language design meeting is somewhat orthogonal to those discussions. It has to do with things like, how does this type affect over resolution? Like, how does this syntax play with the other syntaxes over here? Like, is it unambiguously parsable in all cases? Or how do we light up this feature when we want to have code that was compiled for the later version of the compiler consumed by lower version of the compiler? Those things play, and those things they don't have to log in. They have all the runway in the world they want. I mean, quite frankly, I don't care whether they support language semantics in whatever the next release is, 7.5 or 7.8 or 8 or like whatever timeline they put it on. But they cannot change the way the language binds to the API. Right? That's the thing we have to log in, which seems. I mean, given that the proposal is pretty detailed already, like it seems not unreasonable. Like we have enough design points, I think, to drive that.
By the way, I remind you your comment on value tuple that we should not do anything like that ever again.
So, like to be very clear, like I'm not pushing for this being an OOP. I'm not saying making this an OOP is easy or hard. My statement is mostly realization of the world we live in, which is the languages evolve, the platform evolves. And there will always be cases where somebody will make a business decision and say, I want this feature or this slice of the feature, no pun intended, to be available out of that. And I mean, our system has to handle this somehow. It's just, how expensive are those things and what does it mean for the
So
service?
I agree with you, except I think I talked with Peter and we basically said, span, let's grandfather it, because we basically didn't realize that we have this massive problem. By the time we already signed up all customers and like Kestrel and pipelines, and it would be just a mess to completely change it and give with these problems. Just go for it. From now on, we don't make in this meeting, in the API review meeting, these kind of decisions. It needs I agree with you that we will probably have to do it. Yes. But we agreed on a separate process for this. It needs to be very explicit, and more people need to be in the loop than just us before we kind of make this decision.
And I think, like to me, it's I think what this room is good for is things like finding out interdependencies and say it would be really good if we could ship it in 2.1 because then we don't have to solve the problem on the OOP side. We can assume things are there. If we can't make it for 2.1, then, it is whatever it is, right? Like, it's as simple as that.
Well, I think, if we cannot make it for 2.1, at least more people in our organization will understand, the trade-offs. Because I think so far there's been a bit of a kind of wishful thinking, like, let's not do it. And now, for example, once we decide not to do it for range, the implications will be very, very obvious.
Yes.
And not that it's we will be in a nice place, but at least the implications will be obvious. So more people will feel educated on
more people will be forced to understand it upside down.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say the reason education is we drag more people into the mud, right?
Yes, but it's good because right now we are in the mud and other people are not, and they basically imagine this fictionary, beautiful world where we don't ship OOPs and everything just works correctly.
Yes.
And they yell at us when we tell them you cannot add this API.
And they want the cake and eat it too, and blah blah blah. So
Friday discussion, anyone?
Well, that's a discussion I think right now that is going on the
on that topic.
On that topic, yes.
Awesome.
So, how about this? So we didn't really cover any APIs, so you did a good job.
1 hour.
Eric, like, is it something you need feedback on this week? Should I set up another one for Thursday, or do we think we can push this off for next year and focus on the range discussion?
I would really like to get a preview version of this out with .NET Core 2.1 Preview 1.
Which means
Choose when?
you don't have dates announced.
Well, like, is this like this year?
Yeah, but we should finish up this year ideally.
Okay.
Is there any problem actually shipping the preview this way without the API review? Are we gonna feel like
So we generally have never shipped previews without any API reviews.
Okay,
I mean, we reserve rights.
I heard that this
things like that.
I saw a commit or a PR from Eric St. John in the CoreFX lab that was like, take review feedback from the API review. Like, has there already been a round of reviews?
So there was a round with Eric, Christoph, and myself, and I think that was the only people in the room, if I remember correctly. And it was like a very early look at this whole thing. I think, but since then, I think the thing has also evolved quite a bit. I would say before we should probably do another round. So then the question is just technically when does it have to happen? Like, I'm fine with setting up a 2-hour slot on Thursday. Like, getting meeting room right now is easy. Like, you guys.
I'm fine with that.
Let's set it up.
Thursday. Yeah. All right. Then we set up a slot for Thursday.
Include white space equals true.
Yeah, I was just looking.
Is this format okay?
What do you see?
Is the format of what I presented okay? Like, or do you want things changed?
Yes, I want things changed. Like, what you present here is the reference assembly, because you have all the bodies and you have all the attributes and everything is fully qualified. If you open the thing in API Reviewer, you can also just copy and paste that representation. But ideally, just send me the Apex, or send me the module, and I can create the Apex out of it myself. Did you hear what I said?
Send you the DLL?
Yeah, that's the easiest way to do it.
Okay. Yeah, I was unclear on how you wanted it, like, formatted and structured.
Rows and get set.
Well, like you look at this thing, for example, right? Because usually what you want is oh great, that's working really good. You just want a semicolon here. You don't want system.numerics. Like, we just want to have it short because it's almost like I'm not a human compiler.
I see.
I want to read the thing like.
Okay.
That's a little.
I mean, I can run that as well. Okay, that's I used what we gen the ref assemblies for. Yeah, the ref.
Usually when I look at like 10 APIs, having it in the GitHub issue is usually fine because I just write the bullet points after. If we review like here where you have like hundreds of APIs, and Apex is somewhat nicer because I can just tag the APIs with a comment, and then it's somewhat more in context. But like it's not like the high order bit here. Like if you just send me the module, like I can just open it, present it, and then add comments as we go. All right, then let's have a meeting for Thursday. We should have another conversation with Jared on range. And with Matt on what the design points are, whether we can close on that.
Are we on next week?
Sorry?
Are we on next week?
That's a great question. Look, I will be in next week. I don't know what about you guys. If you guys are like there's no point.
I'll be in, just not available in the morning.
I will be working next week, but I would prefer to work from home.
Work from home as well.
But I will come. Like I don't want to work from home whole week, but I want to work from home several days.
So like I think we only have. Let me just do a quick.
We have like seven easy things starting. Actually,
I can make it a 10.
Yeah, I don't mind like doing next week. I mean, we can just do the 1 hour triage.
Another option is to do it offline. We have literally like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things which are simple. So, which I would like to get for the holidays because people might jump on them. Finally, we have 3 things in networking. So, yay!
All right, then I think we have it.
Did you want me to sync up with the language people, or
I wouldn't mind being involved because I'm technically on that review meeting set as well, but I did a horrible thing the last 3 weeks of attending to Net Standard. If you just CC me, that's fine.
Okay.
And then the other thing
Christoph, do you want to be involved as well?
Send me an email. CC me.
And then the other question is like, do you have done any thinking on the lower bound, upper bound kind of thing? Because I think that would also be useful if you have some code samples for how that is useful. I think that's the thing that I don't think they cover at all right now in their spec.
Okay. So you want like scenarios why that's useful?
Yeah, like I think what I would like to see is like the sample code that Seth had, where you basically slice out a whole dimension essentially, or you skip the first two or something like that. But then you want to take everything after that.
Yep. Okay.
So
I can easily grab scenarios for that.
Yeah, that would be sweet. All right, then thank you guys, and thank you guys online, and then see you next week.